You need people where there's enough grace and safety where you can be your truest self, right? And your truest self might not be the self that you want to be or that Jesus ultimately wants you to be, but a place where you can actually express the reality of where you're at.
Right.
Welcome to Practicing the Practices. This is an experiential podcast where we not only want to help you learn about the way of Jesus, we want to help you practice the way of Jesus in your everyday life. Welcome to episode 2 of season 3 of Practicing the Practices. Here as always with my co-host Casey. Casey, in our last episode, we talked about some of the problems and challenges of loneliness and the friendship epidemic, if you might say, that we're in isolation. And today, we're going to kind of take another step into this conversation on friendship.
That's right, Brad. And we're not just going to talk about any old friendship. We are going to talk about spiritual friendship today.
And this is really important. So we just want to get right at it. So you have 4 important questions for us to consider regarding spiritual friendship. Tell us what they are.
So the first one, very simply, is what is spiritual friendship? And, you know, as we talk about friendship as a spiritual practice, that might seem new to us. So what is spiritual friendship? Love this definition from Adele Calhoun, Spiritual Disciplines Handbook. Go ahead and make fun of me, Brad.
Adele Calhoun, if you're ever listening.
I love you so much, Adele.
Casey loves you. Continue.
She's got the best definitions. Spiritual friendship, to develop a friendship that encourages and challenges me to love God with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength. So that leads us into our second question, which is what sets spiritual friendship apart from other friendships in my life? And that definition we just gave kind of starts to inform that. We're not just talking about any friendship, we're talking about specifically spiritual friendship. And so spiritual friendship is, as a practice, is a step beyond just companionship or shared interests. That doesn't mean those things are bad. You might, my daughter plays volleyball, and I have relationships with moms on the volleyball team. They're not my spiritual friends, but they're still my friends. I care about them.
Sure.
If their kid needs a ride to volleyball practice, I'll do that. We're friends. But spiritual friends is a step beyond that. There's a sense of mutuality. So it talks about, encouraging and challenging one another to love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. In order to do that, there needs to be some intentionality. And of course, pointing each other towards Jesus is one of the marks of a spiritual friendship. And I think it's interesting that as we were talking about today, and we talked last episode a little bit about the one another's in Scripture, this is kind of our framework for how we're looking at what it means to do really deep friendship with other believers in Jesus. And there is this difference between one another versus a more like non-reciprocal friendship. Like, for instance, somebody that I'm doing a service project for, that doesn't need to be a reciprocal relationship. That's not a one another type relationship. That's me reaching and loving somebody with the love of Jesus and serving them if I'm on a mission trip. Yeah. We're really talking about the reciprocal relationship between two believers to really invest deep spiritually in each other's lives.
So there is, I think, in us a sense that we are looking for deeper, more meaningful relationships. Like we just know it unconsciously. Matter of fact, there's a couple of great books. The Life We're Looking For, Andy Crouch, Finding Your People, or something to that effect with Jenny Allen. And both of them kind of interestingly kind of begin their book with some neuroscience. And neuroscience tells us that when a baby comes into the world, they open their eyes. The first thing a baby does upon entering into this universe is to begin to look for someone. And then when they find that someone, of course, they're super blurry and it's hard to figure them out. But the next thing is to begin to form attachment and connection. And with a baby, that begins with physical touch and being fed and held. It is hardwired into us by our divine creator to have deep, meaningful friendships. Now, we can't have deep, meaningful friendships with all planet Earth. Like you've kind of covered that very well. But if we find ourselves on an island, if we find ourselves with no one to share some of the challenges and hardships we're going through, the temptations and sin and screw ups that we've experienced. Also, like the joys and celebrations, like that's a dangerous spot. That's not a place that Jesus wants us to be. And so what we really want to do is we really want to have a good working definition. You've given us a good definition, but an understanding of actually what it is that we're looking for in this practice of spiritual friendship.
Yeah, so that leads us to our third question, which is what qualities are we needing and are we looking for in spiritual friendships? What are the qualities of a spiritual friendship? And I think it's good, like you said, we kind of got to just pay attention. If there's nobody that knows me deeply in my life, I need to start really paying attention to what am I looking for and what are the obstacles, like we talked about last episode, that are preventing me from having anyone in my life that really knows me deeply. So the first quality or the first category kind of that we're looking for, and we're going to talk about several of the one another's in scripture as we look through this, is grace and safety. These friendships are full of grace for one another and safety. A couple of the one another's that come to mind in this is do not speak against one another. And in James 4, it talks about not speaking evil against each other, about not grumbling against one another. So that speaks to both grace and safety. We need to speak gracious words about our spiritual friends and our friends in general. And we also need to not be trustworthy. Like we're not going to be gossiping about them. That creates safety. If we don't believe that the person on the other side of this friendship is going to have our best interest at heart, is not going to trash us in front of other people, then we're not going to feel safe to really let ourselves be known. Also, do not judge one another. Same thing. And that's a really big one for me. If I feel like I'm going to be judged when I share something hard or when I share something from my truest, deepest self, I just know that I'm not going to share it. Like, who are those people that you can be snotty in front of, that you can like really let your true self without any kind of exterior putting on be seen?
And I think it'd be a really good time to kind of press in on that, differentiate a little bit, because don't judge me can become a blanket for don't challenge me,
right? Don't
confront me with anything. That's not what we're saying. We're saying that you need people where there's enough grace and safety where you can be your truest self, right? And your truest self might not be the self that you want to be or that Jesus ultimately wants you to be, but a place where you can actually express the reality of where you're at.
Right.
I love this quote by Jenny Allen. She says, "We all need friends. You and I need friends who, instead of trying to fix us, help us fix our eyes more firmly on Jesus."
Wow, that's really good.
I have a problem with this. So just in the spirit of confession, also, pro tip, go back to the end of season 2, listen to our series on confession. One of the challenges for folks like me who are kind of notorious fixers is you might share, hey, here's what's going on. And my immediate impulse is how do I fix you? And nothing makes you feel less valued or less seen by a friend than when your friend begins to treat you like oil that needs to be changed or laundry that needs to be done, a project, right? No, like a person of grace and safety has the capacity to absorb, to hear, and to not immediately go into solving mode, right?
Right.
That's what we're talking about, not judging. Like, hey, who can just actually sit with me in some of this stuff?
Right. Like, for instance, I might be in a really hard phase where I'm really frustrated with God. I'm really disappointed by God. I know that the big capital T truth is that God never disappoints us. God never lets us down. That's true. But what feels really true in my life at that moment is I'm disappointed. I'm let down. And I need a friend that can just sit and listen to me say that, and without going, oh, don't be disappointed in God, Casey. Like, there's times for encouragement. We're going to talk about that in a little bit, but there's also times to just be like, man, that's hard. I've been there too, friend, and I'm here with you in this without judgment.
So again, grace and space. There's a lot of conversations about safe spaces when you think about college campuses. That's not what we're actually talking about either. But a safe space also speaks to the way I'm going to honor some of your challenges, right? I'm not going to gossip about you. I'm not going to speak evil of you. I'm not going to exploit it. Some of those things, like what you entrust me with, I'm going to honor it.
Yeah. And another thing about creating a safe space is a space of empathy where I really relate to what you're feeling from a place of comfort and care. Those are two more one another's. Comfort one another. I love this from 2 Corinthians 13:11. Finally, brothers, rejoice, aim for restoration, comfort one another, and caring for one another. Really taking the time to, as a verb, care for someone, not just thinking caring thoughts towards them, but actually
Not in the abstract.
acting in I guess it's a verb either way, but for those of you grammarians out there, but in an actual action verb, caring for one another. I love this quote by Henry Nouwen to kind of close out this section on safety and caring for one another and creating a gracious space. He says, when we honestly ask ourselves which persons in our lives mean the most to us, we often find that it is those who, instead of giving much advice, solutions, or cures, have chosen rather to share our pain and touch our wounds with a gentle and tender hand. The friend who can be silent with us in a moment of despair or confusion, who can stay with us in an hour of grief and bereavement, who can tolerate not knowing, not curing, not healing, and face with us the reality of our powerlessness. That is the friend who cares.
It's good. So we want to have a robust vision for this. So kind of ingredient number one or category number one is a spiritual friendship has grace and safety. What else?
The second one is kind of the opposite in a way. Not the opposite, but just the other side of the coin, I guess I should say. Tenacity and risk. So I think we talked about last time, if all we're doing is just kind of enjoying fun, joyful moments together and all the good things of life, but we're never willing to have those hard conversations, that's not a true spiritual friendship. And so some of the one another's or the ideas that we're looking at here under tenacity and risk is, first of all, just the courage to ask the hard questions. You might think of a one another, exhort one another, which I did a little word study. Brad and I both love word studies. And the word exhort comes from the Latin verb hortari, which means to incite or urge, or making almost a way of saying to really, really urge someone. So I struggle with this. I don't want to pressure anybody, but there are times where our people, our spiritual friends need to be exhorted. They need to be urge to move in the direction that God's calling them to go. And they also need to be encouraged. What do you want to tell us about encouragement?
Well, in the spirit of etymology, encourage literally means to give strength to someone's heart. Casey, I said this a little bit earlier to you, that there is no one in our contact list on our phone, no one in our sphere of influence who is suffering from too much encouragement. Matter of fact, almost everyone we encounter is in an encouragement deficit. So tenacity and risk is about us kind of moving into some of those spaces to speak life into people. And sometimes that's to really encourage them. Hey, you can do this. Like, go for it. Be tenacious. Take the risk. Hey, let's go on this adventure. And then there's the risk too, where it's sometimes it's the hard piece, right? And there's two sides to this, right? There is the courage to give feedback that might sting a little bit, and then there's the wisdom and humility to receive it. I love this from Henry Cloud. He wrote in his book, "Safe People: How to Find Relationships That Are Good for You and Avoid Those That Aren't." He says every relationship has problems, because every person has problems. And the place that our problems appear most glaringly is in our close relationships. Think our close friendships. The key is whether or not we can hear from others where we are wrong and accept their feedback without getting defensive. Time and time again, the Bible says someone who listens to feedback from others is wise, but someone who does not is a fool. So I think when we're talking about tenacity and risk, and we're talking about courage and encouragement, like part of that is in a healthy friendship, we're able to have the courage and humility to ask for feedback and then also to receive it.
Yeah, that as we're thinking about more of the one another's in this kind of category of tenacity and risk, a hard one that you're talking about, speak the truth to one another.
Yeah.
Ephesians 4:25, having put away falsehood, let each of you speak the truth with his neighbors, for we are members of one another. And there's more instances of that, speaking the truth to one another. And that's a hard one. And, I think I've shared it on the podcast before, but my husband has this question that he talks about with people that he coaches. What's it like to be on the other side of me? Your spiritual friends should be able to answer that for you. And that's really hard. It's really intimate. It's really vulnerable to ask somebody, hey, what's it honestly like to be on the other side of me? And don't just tell me the great things, because obviously there's good things or they wouldn't be your friend, right? But what are the hard things about being on the other side of me? Because if they won't tell me, probably no one will.
And that's actually one of the ways in a healthy relationship that you experience the most honor and love. I had a friend recently be honest with me and say, hey, I wouldn't actually want the best for you or be loving to you if I didn't express what I experienced from you. And the truth is they were right. Like there was a moment where I just was unthoughtful and, I took them for granted and they said so. And that was hard for me to hear, but also it gave me a chance to say, man, that's on me. Here's the specific ways that I goofed up, I dropped the ball. And it allowed actually a path to reconciliation, right? And so like that's actually a sign of good friendship. Is not only is there this grace and safety, but it's actually the grace and safety that's got to be done right. That's got to be first. That grace and safety is what creates the environment for this tenacity and risk that actually makes friendships like really robust and sharpening and helps us grow.
Yeah. And you mentioned this already, Brad, but one more category here under this idea of tenacity and risk is confessing sins to one another. And if you're interested in that, we have a whole podcast episode on it. So go listen to it.
I think it's coming back up though, Casey, because this is in our culture, this is just not appreciated. It is not practiced in a healthy way. Most of us are so insecure. Most of us have got such identity problems that we have a hard time even confessing to ourselves where we've fallen short, much less to someone else. But man, what a pathway to liberation it is, and what an absolutely essential ingredient to spiritual friendship.
Absolutely. So our third and final kind of category here of how to think about whether a friendship is a healthy friendship in general, and certainly if it's a healthy spiritual friendship, would be this idea of service and mutuality. So when we think about one another, the word one another, it kind of assumes reciprocity, meaning I'm doing this for you and you're doing this for me. It doesn't just say, Brad, you greet Casey. It says greet one another.
Yes.
And so there are times in the Bible where it talks about, true religion is taking care of the orphans and the widows. And those kind of relationships don't assume as much reciprocity, but these one another's assume that we're doing this in community for one another.
Here's one of the major roadblocks to spiritual friendship or friendship period. And this is going to sting out there. I'm just going to say some truth. I'm going to speak the truth to our listeners. Some of you who are listening have limitations in your friendships because of your self-sufficiency. You hate the idea that you need other people or that you need help. But actually, I think, again, I want to quote Henry Cloud here. He's done a lot of work on this. He says this, I think this is brilliant. He says, make friends with your needs. Welcome them. Welcome your needs is what he's saying. He says, your needs are a gift from God designed to draw you into relationship with him and with his safe people. Your needs are the cure to the sin of self-sufficiency. A little dramatic there, but actually, Casey, one of the reasons I think that sometimes our dynamics lack reciprocity is we just don't want to admit that we actually need help. Maybe it's simple help as like, hey, can you help me move this weekend? Because I don't want to be that person, right? Or we feel like we should be able to get all of our tasks done and to invite someone else. And I'm guilty of this as anyone, but man, our needs actually are the pathway to mutuality and friendship. I don't have everything that I need. And so my wife has things that she is able to give me that I need, that my friend Brian, my friend Kyle, like they provide things and pieces to me that I could not have on my own. And that's actually a good thing. Me needing other people is not a bad thing. It's a sign of humanity. It's how God made us to be.
Yeah. And it's honestly a lot more vulnerable to accept help than to give help most of the time. Like one of the one another's here I have is washing one another's feet. And I think, in this case, I'm not saying you have to physically wash the feet of your spiritual friend, although if you want to, that'd be great. But it's really just an act of vulnerable service. It's an intimate act of service. And I don't know if you've ever been to a foot washing, Brad, but I have. And receiving that was one of the most uncomfortable things I have ever. Giving it to somebody else was not. Washing somebody else's feet wasn't that bad. Having somebody wash my feet was probably one of the most uncomfortable things. So I really resonate with the disciples when they're like, no, don't wash my feet. That's so uncomfortable. And it's so humbling. And so what does it look like as we practice reciprocity, what does it look like to practice vulnerability of like mutual, intimate service of one another in ways where we have to admit we need each other? You shared something with me about another one of these one another's, greet one another, that I thought was interesting.
Yeah, the most used one another in the New Testament is not love one another or forgive one another or be kind to one another. It's actually greet one another with a holy kiss. And of course, in their ancient custom, you would, in a very appropriate way, greet a friend, a relative with this kind of holy kiss on the cheek, right?
Is it like a Hollywood air kiss kind of thing, do you think?
Maybe. I think it would be more akin to an embrace, a hug, a fist bump between two friends who really like each other. I think there is, in God's creative design, healthy, appropriate, necessary physical connection that when we embrace, when we handshake, when we fist bump, like we're saying, hey, I am for you, I am with you, but it's both ways, right? It's not me just coming to you, it's you're coming to me. Like we are hugging each other, we are shaking each other's hands, we are offering this mutuality to one another. That's really a beautiful thing in God's design for us people.
Yeah. And finally, this mutuality is characterized by prayer. Certainly a spiritual friendship, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about prayer for one another, with one another, would need to be a really important part of this friendship. Pray for one another is one of the one another's. Pray for one another that you may be healed. James 5, the prayer of a righteous person has great power, and as it is working. And so with all of those categories in mind, Brad, we're going to turn the tables a little bit, and you are going to lead us in our closing practice today.
Yeah, so usually at this time, the music plays, and Casey's very soothing voice invites you into a quiet, contemplative space, which is wonderful and good, and frankly, probably uncomfortable for many of you, and maybe you even fast forward to that section. But actually today, we're going to do the opposite. I'm going to actually say something that sounds absolutely shocking for a pastor to say, but this is no time to pray. This is a time to actually act and obey. My guess is if you've listened to this episode, the Holy Spirit, we would say, has probably exposed or moved you in one of these areas, maybe in the area of grace and safety, or maybe in the area of tenacity and risk, or maybe in this area of reciprocity, the mutuality of serving one another. And probably a friend or a relationship has come to mind. And here's the challenge, here's the practice. When we sign off on this episode, pull your phone out and do something about what's going on in your heart and mind right now. If it's a friend, they could really use some encouragement. Call them immediately. Write them a note today. Maybe you've been having imaginary arguments with somebody you're close to, and it's time for you to sit down over a cup of coffee and just ask and press into the hard thing. You've been avoiding it for 6 months or 2 years. Today, 10 seconds of courage, make that call. Maybe you've been like me and just sometimes unwilling to welcome help. Maybe actually what you need to do is call someone up and ask for their help, for assistance, for insight. Maybe to ask the question Neil has asked. Hey, I just really want to grow, and I want to be humble, and I just want to say, hey, what's it like to be on the other side of me? Where could I grow in my leadership, or where could you see that I could grow in my walk with Jesus, or whatever it might be, right? So don't just think about this. Don't just have one of those, that's some good advice or that's good insight, but actually do something with what we said today. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Practicing the Practices. Go ahead and subscribe or follow on your favorite podcast platform. And if you don't mind, leave us a review. Reviews help more people engage with the podcast and as a result, encounter the way of Jesus. Until next time, grace and peace.